Hello, beautiful community. While there are more than three sides here, let's talk cartoonishly as though we're talking about Ukraine, the West, and Russia in light of possible negotiations with several possible outcomes against a background of justified skepticism about progress that we should have. So, Trump is in a position where he is after a W, and he is more after the perception of a W, a win, than he is after a real win. But hopefully the gap between a real win and something that can be dressed up as a win isn't that wide. Trump's administration is clearly now open to the idea that this is important and that if there are negotiations, they may be extremely difficult and take a long time. The understanding in Trump's team of the domestic politics of Russia and Ukraine is poor, but you can expect them to catch up more easily on what's happening in Ukraine than on what's happening in Russia, because Russians are much more like a bunch of mentalists and they're harder to understand because they are so drunk on ideology that you have to grasp before you anticipate their intent. Ukraine is deeply concerned about 3 or 4 factors at the moment ahead of possible negotiations. One is military support from the West. The second is the West's capacity to take seriously various economic ways that pressure can be put on Russia. And with these two factors, there is this precarity of dependence, right? Ukraine desperately needs something that it doesn't control. The third element is the state of the front, which is in a difficult place at the moment. Obviously not as difficult as in the early weeks of the war, but arguably as difficult as any moment since then. And then fourth, there is a slide in trust in the current government in Ukraine, and that's also a problem, which raises the issue of having an election, which is a nightmarish issue because it is so externally politicized. Because Putin wants there to be an election in Ukraine, and Putin wants to do everything in his power to maximally destabilize Ukraine's domestic politics. And he don't want to play into his hands. Now, when it comes to the front, the weakness of the front, there is a manpower issue on both sides, but Ukraine's manpower issue is a bit more urgent than Russia's. If you asked me what would happen to Putin if his manpower issue got critical, could he do another mass mobilization in 2026 or even a few months from now? My answer to that question would be that he could, but it would require a restructuring in the balance of politicization and depoliticization in society of the kind that occurred at the beginning of the war. When Russia began the full-scale invasion, it failed so miserably, they had to immediately begin resetting into a few new totalitarian terms that they hadn't planned to make so immediately, because they wouldn't have had to do that had they had their 3-day walk in the park experience that they fantasized about. Now, in Ukraine, this is a slightly more urgent issue, and the politics of voluntary conscription has gone well and far, but it's rather exhausted itself. And what you're looking for now is a new politics of recruitment for the military and it's on balance not succeeding. And what you're looking for there is a blend of coercion, patriotism, and high rewards. And you're not getting enough of the second two at the moment. And the problem with patriotism is that it also requires a coherent picture of victory, and Ukraine is in the middle of reframing or just keeping up in the air what good outcomes are. So it's a very, very difficult thing to do. These are incredibly difficult challenges. And then you add to that the trend of degradation of trust in the current government, and that raises very, very significant challenges too. So Ukraine is in a very difficult position. It certainly needs the Trump administration to maintain a moral seriousness and a discipline about this and do the West's bit. But there is something else that's also the West's bit that's very important for Ukraine, and that's security guarantees. Because another issue for Ukraine is not just how do you protect Ukraine from Putin reinvading in 2030, but how do you protect and stabilize Ukraine and permit it to flourish economically in that in-between period too. And what you've got, it's very important constellation of needs for Ukraine, is that you've got to have security guarantees to have a degree of economic flourishing. And you've got to have a degree of economic flourishing to maintain stability. And you've got political stability, and you've got to maintain political stability to snuff out any attempts by Putin to destabilize Ukraine's domestic politics. So a heck of a lot rests on what's effectively going to be a European decision about whether for Ukraine to be defended against the Russians, it needs just a strong military supported by the West, or whether it needs more than that. Now, I don't make policy recommendations very naturally on the channels, but this is a clear position of mine that Ukraine needs security guarantees, not just for its security, but for our security in the West and for our capacity to even say honestly to ourselves that we are able to condition the security arrangements under which we live, as opposed to outsourcing that conditioning to the tyrant in the Kremlin, Mr. Putin. So these are some of the big challenges that we have in the West and that Ukraine has. Now, when it comes to the tyrant in the Kremlin, probably tomorrow, and if there's some health event, then on Monday, but aiming for tomorrow, there's a video on the main channel of a somewhat biographical and psychobiographical nature about what Putin's biggest problems and fears are when it comes to negotiations. So for health reasons, as you know, the main channel has been struggling recently, and it's also been hit by something called the invalid traffic bug, which doesn't just demonetize it, it also creates a problem with getting views. So when the video comes out, YouTube will not necessarily be deeply keen to show it to you. So if you're a lover of the main channel, refresh yourself by just revisiting it and maybe clicking on the bell icon and so on, so you get shown that video. Putin is extremely tense at the moment because he doesn't quite know how to handle this business of possible negotiations. And he's stuck between two options while prioritizing one over the other, but being open to the other two. His first option is to exploit negotiations by participating in them without wanting to negotiate seriously. And that's his default position, right? Using negotiations, the process of negotiations to win the war. But he's not completely close to a deal. That's important to understand. And he is working very, very hard, doing a lot of mental work about how to balance these two. And he doesn't know what the answer is. And actually, the West's strategy in negotiations with Putin will be to persuade Putin into something that he thinks undermines Ukraine more than carrying on the war does, that actually strengthens Ukraine more than carrying on the war does. So if you're cleverer than Trump's people and Trump himself, that's what you'd be trying to do. You'd be trying to sell a consolidation of Ukraine to Putin as a weakening of Ukraine. And there are really levers to pull there, because Putin's views about the self-immolation of the West and Putin's views about crisis in Ukraine are overdetermined and exaggerated. So you could really persuade Putin that a certain kind of cessation of war will be more disastrous for Ukraine than it actually will be. And that should be the Western strategy. But it's very hard for us to be seriously strategic. And it's unfortunate that we're relying on an orange buffoon to deliver this. And it's also a problem that the buffoon is dismantling the remnants of the post-1989 global order, while also trying to do useful or useless things in connection with Ukraine, which we're going to see what happens there. But you can't detach the two either, because we're only interested in Ukraine because Ukraine is in the world, and things in the world are causally interrelated with Ukraine, right? We're interested in how our world is going. We're interested in our own security. And so we can't say, oh, here are a couple of not too bad things Trump might do about Ukraine, and it's okay that he is an agent of rapid intensification of US imperial decline, which he is. So you've got to be honest about seeing the big picture with Trump as being unlovely on the global stage. But Putin's predicament is essentially one of having no answers about how to balance the options in front of him in possible negotiations. And he is, in the way we'll explore in a bit more detail, hopefully tomorrow, concerned about making a very big mistake. So lots of love, and see you on the main channel tomorrow, or Monday. 80% chance I think it's going to be Sunday tomorrow. Bye-bye.